Hello, friends. Welcome back to Book Demystified. I really hope you're doing well today, because the book we're diving into, How to Manage Your Money When You Don't Have Any, by Erik Wecks, hits something that most of us feel but rarely say out loud. That moment when you're scrolling through your banking app at 2 in the morning, watching those numbers that never seem to add up the way the finance gurus promised they would. You know what I'm talking about. That pit in your stomach when rent is due tomorrow and your checking account is doing that thing where it pretends $27 is actually enough to cover groceries, gas, and somehow still leave you feeling like a responsible adult. Erik Wecks wrote this book because he lived it. Not the sanitized version of financial struggle that gets packaged into neat little blog posts, but the real, messy version where you're choosing between fixing your car and buying decent food for the week. Where budgeting apps feel like they were designed by people who've never had to decide whether that $5 coffee is worth skipping lunch. This isn't another book written by someone who forgot what it feels like to check your account balance with genuine fear. And here's what hit me hard about Wecks' approach. He starts with a confession that most financial experts would never make. He admits that when you're barely getting by, most traditional budgeting advice isn't just useless, it's insulting. It's like someone handing you a map to Paris when you're lost in your own neighborhood and can't afford bus fare home. All those envelope methods and 50-30-20 rules, they assume you have money left over after covering your basics. They assume your biggest problem is deciding between saving for vacation or investing in your retirement fund. But what happens when your biggest problem is making it to payday without your debit card getting declined at the grocery store? What happens when budgeting feels less like planning your financial future and more like performing surgery on yourself with a butter knife? That's where most of us actually live, and that's exactly where Wecks starts his conversation. You know that feeling when you're stuck and don't even know why? When everyone around you seems to have figured out this whole money thing, and you're still trying to understand how they make $35,000 feel like enough to build a life on. Wecks gets it because he was there. He was the guy working multiple part-time jobs, watching his friends post vacation photos on Instagram while he was calculating whether he could afford to drive to work that week. Let me tell you what hit me hard about his story. Wecks talks about this moment when he realized that being broke isn't a character flaw. It's a math problem with real constraints that most financial advice completely ignores. He spent years feeling like he was failing at something everyone else had naturally figured out, like there was some secret adult handbook that got passed around and somehow his copy got lost in the mail. But the truth is, when you're living paycheck to paycheck, or when there's more month left at the end of your money than the other way around, traditional budgeting advice feels like being told to organize your sock drawer when your house is on fire. This is where Wecks does something different. Instead of starting with pie charts and categories and color-coded spreadsheets, he starts with something much more basic and much more honest. He starts with the reality that when you don't have money, managing money isn't about optimization, it's about survival. And survival has its own rules. Think about it this way. Most budgeting advice assumes you're playing a game where you get to choose your moves. But when you're broke, you're not playing a game. You're solving a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and someone keeps changing the picture on the box. Your car breaks down and suddenly that carefully planned budget becomes worthless paper. Your hours get cut at work and all those neat little categories collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Wecks talks about something he calls survival budgeting, and it's probably the most honest thing I've ever read about money management. He acknowledges that when you're in survival mode, budgeting isn't about building wealth or even about building stability. It's about making it through this week, this month, this crisis without completely falling apart. And there's no shame in that. There's actually wisdom in it. Here's what I mean. Traditional budgeting tells you to track every expense, categorize everything, and stick to your plan. But when you're broke, tracking every expense just becomes a detailed record of all the ways you're failing to have enough money. It's like keeping a diary of everything you can't afford. Wecks suggests something radically different. Instead of tracking where your money went, start with tracking where your money has to go. The non-negotiables. The things that will actually destroy your life if you don't pay them. Rent or mortgage, because homelessness isn't a budgeting category, minimum payments on debt because collections calls don't respect your financial philosophy, basic utilities, and he means real food, not the rice and beans martyrdom that some financial advisors preach like it's a virtue. Everything else is negotiable. And this is where Wecks' approach gets revolutionary. He doesn't tell you to cut everything fun out of your life and live like a monk until you've saved 6 months of expenses. Instead, he acknowledges that being human costs money, and trying to budget the humanity out of your life is how you end up breaking your budget in spectacular, guilt-inducing ways.
Ever spent your night Googling how to stop spending money and ended up deep in a thread about people who haven't bought new clothes in 3 years and somehow feel superior about it? Yeah, that's not sustainable either. Wecks talks about something he calls minimum viable happiness, figuring out the smallest amount of money you need to spend to not feel completely deprived and resentful about your financial situation. Maybe that's $15 a month for coffee dates with friends. Maybe it's $20 for streaming services because coming home to absolutely nothing fun feels like punishment for being poor. Maybe it's buying the name brand peanut butter because eating food that tastes like cardboard every single day makes you feel like poverty is your identity instead of your temporary circumstance. This is where traditional budgeting gets it completely wrong. It treats every dollar like it has the same emotional weight, like choosing between spending $5 on coffee or putting it in savings is purely a mathematical decision. But when you're broke, money isn't just math, it's emotion, it's dignity, it's hope. It's the difference between feeling like a person who happens to be struggling financially and feeling like a financial failure who happens to be a person. Wecks shares this story about a period when he was working 2 part-time jobs and going to school, basically living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. He'd saved up enough to buy himself a decent meal at a real restaurant, nothing fancy, just a burger and fries that someone else cooked. But when he got there and saw the prices, he couldn't bring himself to spend the money. He ordered water and sat there for an hour, then went home and ate another peanut butter sandwich. And he realized that being broke had started to change how he saw himself. He wasn't just managing his money, he was managing his sense of worth. That's when he understood something crucial about budgeting when you don't have money. The goal isn't just to make your dollars stretch further. The goal is to make your dollars work in a way that doesn't slowly erode your humanity. And that requires a completely different approach to thinking about money. Instead of starting with income and subtracting expenses, Wecks suggests starting with identity. Who are you when you're not worried about money? What do you value? What makes you feel like yourself? And then, this is the important part, you figure out the minimum cost of maintaining that identity while you work on improving your financial situation. If you're someone who values learning, maybe you need a library card and internet access more than you need cable TV. If you're someone who values connection, maybe you need a phone plan and gas money to visit friends more than you need to eat out. If you're someone who values creativity, maybe you need art supplies or music streaming more than you need the newest clothes. The point isn't to justify every purchase, it's to make conscious decisions about what poverty is allowed to take from you and what it isn't. This approach does something that traditional budgeting never does. It acknowledges that being broke is temporary, but the decisions you make while you're broke shape who you become when you're not broke anymore. If you spend 2 years living like money is evil and pleasure is weakness, you don't just bounce back to normal when your income improves. You carry that scarcity mindset with you, and it affects every financial decision you make for the rest of your life. Wecks learned this the hard way. He talks about finally getting a decent job after years of financial struggle, and for months he couldn't bring himself to buy anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. He was making good money, but he was still living like he was broke because he'd trained himself to see every purchase as a potential disaster. He'd successfully learned to survive financial hardship, but he'd never learned to transition out of survival mode. And this brings us to what might be the most important insight in the entire book.
Managing money when you don't have any isn't just about making it through the hard times. It's about making it through the hard times in a way that doesn't damage your relationship with money permanently. It's about staying financially responsible without becoming financially traumatized. Hey, if you're enjoying this journey and want to support what we do here at Book Demystified, there are a few simple ways. Subscribe, become a channel member, or grab the book using our affiliate link below. And if you're feeling generous, you can even leave a tip via PayPal or UPI. All links are in the description. Every bit helps us bring you more like this. So how do you actually do this? How do you budget when budgeting feels impossible? Wecks breaks it down into what he calls the reality first method, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen in personal finance. First, you start with what he calls the disaster list. These are the things that will actually ruin your life if you don't pay them. Not the things that will make your life harder or less convenient, the things that will genuinely destroy your ability to function. For most people, this is housing, transportation to work, minimum debt payments, and food. That's it. Everything else is secondary. Once you know your disaster number, the minimum amount of money you need to avoid catastrophe, you can start making real decisions about everything else. And here's where it gets interesting. Instead of trying to optimize every dollar, you focus on optimizing your peace of mind. Wecks suggests creating what he calls buffer zones, small amounts of money set aside for specific types of emergencies that broke people face all the time. $20 in cash hidden somewhere for when your card gets declined and you need gas to get home from work. $50 in a separate account when your phone gets shut off and you need it turned back on immediately. $100 for when your car makes that noise that means it's about to stop being a car.
These aren't traditional emergency funds. Those require having money left over after all your other priorities. These are survival funds. They're small enough that you can actually save them, even on a tight budget, but they're targeted enough that when you need them, they solve real problems, instead of just making you feel slightly less anxious about having no money. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it acknowledges the reality of being broke without romanticizing it. Wecks doesn't pretend that poverty builds character or that financial struggle makes you a better person. But he also doesn't treat financial struggle like a moral failing that you need to repent for by living like a hermit. Instead, he treats it like what it is, a temporary problem that requires specific solutions. And one of those solutions is learning to distinguish between the financial advice that applies to your situation and the financial advice that's designed for people in completely different circumstances. Most budgeting advice is written for people who have what Wecks calls discretionary income, money left over after covering all their needs. When you have discretionary income, budgeting is about making choices. Do you want to save more or spend more? Do you want to invest in experiences or things? Do you want to prioritize short-term pleasure or long-term security? But when you don't have discretionary income, when every dollar is already spoken for before you earn it, budgeting becomes about something completely different. It becomes about damage control, about making sure that being broke today doesn't make you more broke tomorrow, about surviving financial hardship without letting it become financial disaster. This is where Wecks introduces what might be the most practical concept in the entire book, the idea of financial triage. Just like medical triage, where doctors treat the most life-threatening injuries first, financial triage means dealing with your most life-threatening financial problems first, and everything else second. Your rent or mortgage, that's a severed artery. It gets attention immediately, no matter what else is happening. Your credit card payment, that's a broken bone. Painful, problematic, but not immediately life-threatening. Your gym membership, that's a bruise, annoying, but it can wait while you deal with the serious injuries. The genius of this approach is that it gives you permission to let some things slide without feeling like you're failing at being an adult. When you're doing financial triage, you're not being irresponsible, you're being strategic. You're making conscious decisions about which problems to solve first and which problems you can afford to let wait. But here's what traditional budgeting never tells you. Sometimes being strategic means accepting that some problems won't get solved. Sometimes it means letting your credit score take a hit because you literally cannot pay everything and still survive.
Sometimes it means choosing between financial responsibility and mental health, between following the rules and feeding your family. Wecks talks about a period when he had to choose between making his student loan payments and keeping his electricity on. According to every piece of financial advice he'd ever received, missing loan payments was financial suicide. But trying to live without electricity wasn't just inconvenient, it was actively dangerous and made it impossible for him to work or study effectively. He chose to keep the lights on and let the loan payments slide. And you know what happened? The world didn't end. His credit score dropped, yes. He had to deal with some unpleasant phone calls, yes. But he was able to keep working, keep studying, and eventually get to a place where he could catch up on those payments. If he'd prioritized the loan payments and lost his electricity, he might have lost his job, his ability to study, and ended up in an even worse financial situation. This is what financial triage actually looks like. It's not about ignoring your obligations, it's about understanding which obligations will kill you if you ignore them, and which ones will just make your life more difficult. And when you're broke, that distinction can be the difference between temporary hardship and permanent disaster. But Wecks doesn't stop there. He also talks about what he calls financial first aid, the small, immediate actions you can take to stop a bad financial situation from getting worse. And these aren't the obvious ones like cutting up your credit cards or switching to generic brands. These are the psychological and practical strategies that actually work when you're in crisis mode. One of the most powerful things he suggests is what he calls the reality check meeting. Once a week, you sit down with yourself, or with a partner if you have one, and you have a completely honest conversation about where you are financially. Not where you want to be, not where you think you should be, but where you actually are. What bills are due this week? What money is actually available to pay them? What problems are you pretending don't exist? The goal isn't to solve every problem in one meeting. The goal is to stop living in denial about your financial situation. Because denial doesn't make problems go away. It just makes them bigger and scarier and harder to solve when you finally have to face them. I couldn't stop thinking about that one moment in my life when I realized I'd been avoiding my bank account for 3 weeks because I was afraid of what I might find there. That's not budgeting. That's financial dissociation. And you can't manage money you're too scared to look at.
Wecks also talks about something he calls the minimum viable budget, the simplest possible system for tracking money when tracking money feels overwhelming. Instead of complex spreadsheets or detailed categories, you track 3 numbers: money coming in this week, money that has to go out this week, the difference between those 2 numbers. That's it. If the difference is positive, you have some room to breathe and maybe even make a small improvement to your situation. If the difference is negative, you know exactly how big the problem is and you can start figuring out how to solve it. If the difference is 0, you're breaking even, which is actually an accomplishment when you're starting from behind. This approach does something revolutionary. It makes budgeting less about judgment and more about information. Instead of tracking every purchase so you can feel bad about your choices, you're tracking the essential information so you can make better choices. And there's a huge psychological difference between those 2 approaches. When budgeting is about judgment, every time you check your balance or update your spreadsheet, you're reminded of all the ways you're failing to be the person you think you should be. But when budgeting is about information, every time you check in with your money, you're gathering data that helps you solve problems and make progress. And this leads to what might be the most important shift in thinking that Wecks offers. He suggests that when you're broke, the goal of budgeting isn't to control your spending. It's to increase your options. Every dollar you save, every debt you pay down, every financial habit you improve doesn't just make your numbers look better. It gives you more choices about how to respond to whatever life throws at you next. When you have a $50 buffer in your account, you have the option to handle small emergencies without going further into debt. When you've paid down some credit card balances, you have the option to use credit for actual emergencies instead of just covering basic expenses. When you've built even small amounts of savings, you have the option to take a day off work when you're sick, instead of working through illness because you can't afford to miss a shift. This is why traditional budgeting advice feels so tone-deaf to people who are struggling financially. It focuses on restriction and sacrifice and discipline, as if the problem with being broke is that you're not trying hard enough to spend less money. But the real problem with being broke is not that you're spending too much. It's that you don't have enough options. Rich people don't have better discipline than poor people. They have more options. When their car breaks down, they have the option to fix it immediately instead of driving it until it dies completely. When they get sick, they have the option to see a doctor instead of hoping it goes away on its own. When they want to change jobs, they have the option to be selective instead of taking the first thing that pays the bills. Budgeting when you don't have money is about slowly, carefully, strategically creating more options for yourself. And that requires a completely different mindset than traditional budgeting teaches. Instead of asking, "How can I spend less money?" Wecks suggests asking, "How can I create more space between my income and my essential expenses?" Instead of, "What can I cut from my budget?" ask, "What would give me more flexibility if something goes wrong?" Instead of, "How can I stick to my plan?" ask, "How can I build a plan that adapts when life doesn't go according to plan?" These questions lead to different answers. Instead of cutting everything that brings you joy, you might focus on reducing your fixed expenses so you have more control over your variable ones. Instead of trying to save a specific amount every month, you might focus on building systems that make saving automatic and painless. Instead of setting rigid spending limits, you might create guidelines that help you make better decisions without feeling like you're living in a financial prison. Wecks shares a story about finally understanding this distinction. He was working with a traditional budget, trying to limit himself to exactly $50 a month for what he called fun money. But he kept going over that limit, sometimes by a little, sometimes by a lot. And then he'd feel guilty and frustrated, and eventually he'd give up on budgeting entirely. Then he tried a different approach. Instead of setting a spending limit, he set a savings goal. Instead of trying to limit his fun spending to $50, he tried to save $50 first and then spend whatever was left over on whatever brought him joy. Some months he spent $70 on fun stuff. Some months he spent $30. But every month he saved $50 first. The total amount of money was roughly the same either way, but the psychological impact was completely different. With the spending limit, every purchase felt like a potential failure. With the savings goal, every purchase felt like a reward for successfully prioritizing his financial goals. Same money, completely different relationship with the decisions he was making about that money. This is what Wecks means when he talks about budgeting for real life instead of budgeting for the fantasy version of yourself that never gets tired or stressed or human. Real-life budgeting acknowledges that you will sometimes spend money on things that don't make perfect financial sense. Real-life budgeting plans for those moments instead of pretending they won't happen. Maybe you'll spend $12 on takeout because you worked a double shift and cooking feels impossible. Maybe you'll buy coffee from the expensive place because you're having a terrible day and you need something small and good to happen. Maybe you'll spend money on a gift for someone you care about, even though technically you can't afford it because relationships matter more than perfect budget adherence.
Traditional budgeting treats these moments like moral failures. Real-life budgeting treats them like predictable human behavior that should be planned for and accommodated. The difference is whether you're building a budget that works with your personality or against it. And this brings us to what might be the most liberating insight in the entire book. Wecks suggests that perfect budgeting isn't the goal, sustainable budgeting is the goal. A budget that you can follow 80% of the time is infinitely more valuable than a budget that you can follow perfectly for 3 weeks before abandoning completely. Think about it this way. If you save $100 a month for 8 months and then have 2 months where you don't save anything, you've still saved $800. But if you set a goal to save $200 a month and then give up after 6 weeks because it's too hard, you've saved maybe $300 and you feel like a failure. The math is clear. The sustainable approach wins. But more importantly, the sustainable approach doesn't leave you feeling like you're bad with money. It leaves you feeling like you're learning to work with your own limitations and strengths to slowly improve your financial situation. This is why Wecks spends so much time talking about what he calls financial self-compassion. Being broke is stressful enough without adding a layer of self-hatred about being broke. Every time you beat yourself up for making an imperfect financial decision, you're making it harder to make better decisions in the future. Self-criticism doesn't motivate sustainable change. It motivates short-term behavior modification followed by spectacular backsliding. If you want to actually improve your financial situation over the long term, you need to treat yourself like someone you're trying to help, not someone you're trying to punish. And here's where Wecks gets really practical. He talks about something he calls financial recovery, the process of slowly rebuilding your financial life after a period of crisis or struggle. And he approaches it exactly like addiction recovery or recovery from trauma. Small steps, sustainable habits, lots of support, and absolute commitment to progress over perfection. In financial recovery, you don't try to fix everything at once. You pick one small area of your financial life and you work on improving just that area until it becomes stable. Maybe you focus on building a $50 emergency fund. Or maybe you focus on never overdrafting your checking account. Or maybe you focus on paying all your bills on time, even if you can't pay them in full. You work on that one area until it's solid, until it doesn't require constant attention and willpower to maintain. Then you pick another area and repeat the process. Slowly, over months and years, you build a financial life that supports you instead of constantly threatening to collapse. This is the opposite of the quick fix mentality that most financial advice promotes. It's not about dramatic changes that transform your life in 90 days. It's about small, boring, sustainable changes that compound over time into a fundamentally different relationship with money. Wecks talks about his own financial recovery taking almost 5 years. 5 years of small improvements, occasional setbacks, and gradual progress toward a place where money was a tool he used instead of a constant source of stress and anxiety. And he's honest about the fact that it was boring and slow and sometimes frustrating, but it worked. Most importantly, it worked in a way that didn't require him to become a completely different person. He didn't have to develop superhuman discipline, or give up everything he enjoyed, or live like a monk until he reached some arbitrary savings goal. He just had to consistently make slightly better decisions about money while still remaining fundamentally himself. And this brings us to the final insight that I think makes this book different from every other piece of financial advice out there. Wecks argues that managing money when you don't have any isn't really about money at all. It's about hope. When you're broke, every financial decision is really a decision about whether you believe your situation will improve. Every dollar you save is a vote of confidence in your future self. Every debt you pay down is an investment in the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. Every small improvement to your financial habits is an act of faith that the work you're doing now will matter later. But hope is fragile when you're struggling, and traditional budgeting advice often makes it harder to maintain hope because it focuses so much on restriction and sacrifice. It asks you to give up things that make you happy today for the promise of financial security tomorrow. And when tomorrow feels uncertain, that trade-off can feel impossible. Wecks suggests a different approach. Instead of sacrificing everything good about today for the promise of a better tomorrow, you make small investments in tomorrow while still treating today with respect. You save what you can without depriving yourself of everything that makes life feel worth living. You pay down debt without cutting yourself off from the relationships and activities that give your life meaning.
This isn't about finding balance. Balance is a luxury for people who have money left over after covering their needs. This is about finding sustainability, about building a financial life that you can maintain even when things get difficult, even when motivation is low, even when life doesn't go according to plan. You know that feeling when you're carrying something heavy and you realize that the way you're holding it is making it heavier than it needs to be? That's what traditional budgeting does to financial struggle. It makes an already difficult situation harder by adding layers of guilt and complexity and perfectionism that don't actually solve the underlying problem. Wecks' approach is like learning to carry that same weight in a way that doesn't destroy your back. The weight doesn't go away, but it becomes manageable. The struggle doesn't disappear, but it stops consuming every moment of every day. And maybe that's the most honest thing anyone has ever said about managing money when you don't have any. The goal isn't to make being broke easy or fun or character building. The goal is to make it survivable without losing yourself in the process. I've been thinking a lot about what this book means for those of us who felt like failures because we couldn't make traditional budgeting work, because we kept trying to follow advice that was written for people in completely different financial situations, because we kept beating ourselves up for not having enough discipline or willpower or commitment to stick to systems that were never designed for our reality. What Wecks offers isn't just different advice about money. He offers permission to be human while you're learning to be better with money. Permission to make mistakes without giving up entirely. Permission to prioritize your mental health alongside your financial health. Permission to believe that you can improve your situation without becoming someone else entirely. And honestly, that permission might be worth more than any specific budgeting technique or saving strategy. Because once you stop wasting energy on guilt and shame and self-criticism, you can use that energy to actually solve problems and make progress and build the financial life you want to live. This book taught me that managing money when you don't have any isn't about deprivation or discipline or moral superiority. It's about clarity and compassion and strategic thinking. It's about understanding the difference between the financial problems that require immediate attention and the ones that can wait. It's about building systems that work with your real life instead of against it. Most of all, it's about remembering that being broke is something that's happening to you, not something that you are. It's a temporary circumstance, not a permanent identity. And the decisions you make while you're navigating that circumstance should be designed to help you move through it with your dignity and humanity intact. If you're struggling with money right now, if traditional budgeting advice has left you feeling more confused and frustrated than empowered, if you're tired of being told that your financial problems would disappear if you just wanted it badly enough, this book offers something different. It offers real strategies for real people dealing with real constraints. But more than that, it offers hope. Not the toxic positivity kind of hope that pretends everything will be fine if you just think positive thoughts. The practical kind of hope that comes from having a plan that actually works in the real world. The sustainable kind of hope that comes from making progress, even when that progress is slower and messier than you'd like it to be. And maybe that's exactly what those of us who are learning to manage money without much of it actually need. Not judgment, not perfectionism, not impossible standards, just practical strategies, honest acknowledgement of how difficult this really is, and permission to be human while we're figuring it out. Because budgeting for real life means budgeting for the life you actually have, not the life you think you should have. And that life, messy and imperfect and human as it is, deserves financial strategies that actually work.